Ukraine's brave and brilliant response to Russia's attack is rightly being celebrated across the world. But it might be obscuring a growing danger. While the assault on Kyiv and the surrounding region has failed, Moscow's strategy in the south and east of Ukraine could well succeed. If it does, Russia will have turned Ukraine into an economically crippled rump state, landlocked and threatened on three sides by Russian military power, always vulnerable to another incursion from Moscow. It will take much more military assistance from the West to ensure that this catastrophic outcome does not come to pass. As Can Kosopoglu, a military scholar and strategist, presciently pointed out in the first few weeks of the war in an essay for the Hudson Institute, there are two distinct wars taking place in Ukraine, one in the north and one in the south. And the latter has been radically more successful for Moscow than the one in the north. Russia has been able to move forces and supplies out of its bases in Crimea and capture the cities of Melitopol and Kherson, while surrounding the city of Mariupol. The latter is now encircled and invaded by Russian troops, and Ukrainian forces trapped in there cannot be resupplied. Ukraine's access to the Sea of Azov has been blocked, and as Kasapoglu points out, Russian forces now have a contiguous land corridor from Crimea deep into Donbass. They are also trying to move west from Kherson to Odessa. Odessa is the prize. As the main port from which Ukraine trades with the world, it is the most important city for Ukraine economically. It's also a city replete with symbolic significance. It was here in 1905 that a mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, made famous by Sergei Eisenstein's movie, marked the beginning of the troubles of Tsarist Russia. Were Odessa to fall, Ukraine would be practically landlocked and the Black Sea would essentially become a Russian lake, which would almost certainly tempt Moscow to then extend its military power into Moldova, which has its own breakaway region filled with many Russian speakers, Transnistria. Putin could present this outcome as a grand victory, liberating Russian speakers, gaining crucial cities and ports, and turning Ukraine into a non-viable vassal state. This must not happen, and the Ukrainians are fighting ferociously to prevent it. In Ukraine's east, the Russians are trying to advance from Kherson through the city of Mykolaiv, but they are being stymied by the extraordinary courage of the city's inhabitants, who have reportedly blown up the bridge that connects the city to Odessa and blocked the railway tracks. This week, Ukrainian forces were able to deploy their never-before-used Neptune missiles and sink the Russian missile cruiser Moskva. Still, it's important to remember that before the invasion, Russia had a 10-to-1 advantage in defense spending over Ukraine, and Putin seems determined to press on no matter the costs. So what can the United States and the West do? Much more of everything they are already doing. Ukraine needs more arms, especially those that give it massive asymmetrical fighting power. General Mark Hertling, who has been farsighted in diagnosing Russia's weaknesses and Ukraine's strengths, explained to me that Ukraine needs more equipment that allows it to maneuver quickly around Russia's rigid forces. That means helicopters, armed Humvees, multiple launch rocket systems, drones of every kind. Turkish drones have proved to be an amazingly effective weapon in this conflict. General Hertling urges that Ukraine be given more of those, as well as American kamikaze drones and intelligence drones. The Russian Navy, which has been massing in the Black Sea, continues to pose a great danger to Odessa, threatening to either lay siege to it or launch an amphibious landing behind Ukrainian lines. Despite the success of the Neptune missile, Ukraine does not have the capacity to stop the Russian Navy. NATO should consider doing something similar to what it did during the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. It should enforce an embargo around those waters, preventing Russian troops from entering to attack Ukraine's cities or resupplying Russian forces. NATO ships would operate from international waters, issuing any approaching ships notice to mariners that NATO forces are active in the area and warnings not to enter. Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, supports the actions the Biden administration has taken, but urges a more aggressive response from the West on all fronts. Give Ukraine fighter planes and air defense systems, he tweeted. Help it with cyber attacks and give it anti-ship missiles to sink Russian ships in the Black Sea. The United States has appropriated about $16 billion in aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, the world is expected to pay about $320 billion to Russia this year for its energy. Economic sanctions will not force Putin to end the war as long as this gaping loophole exists. The only pressure that will force Putin to the negotiating table is military defeat in the south. Putin's Plan A failed, but we cannot let his Plan B succeed. Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. Let's get this latest state of play in Mariupol and the rest of the war from CNN's Matt Rivers, who joins us now from Lviv. Matt, what are you hearing about Mariupol, where the Russian forces are moving in?
Yeah, Fareed, so as of about 4 hours ago, a deadline that for an ultimatum that was given by the Russians for all remaining Ukrainian resistance fighters in the city of Mariupol to lay down their arms and surrender has passed. That was about 4 hours ago, and the Ukrainians said they would not be respecting that ultimatum. They said that they would be ignoring it instead and continuing the defense of their city. The Russians have since acknowledged that the Ukrainians have ignored that ultimatum and said that they vowed to, quote, eliminate any Ukrainian resistance that remains in the city should they decide to keep on fighting. And what all of that means, Fareed, is that the siege of the city of Mariupol, which has gone on for weeks now, to devastating effect in that city, not only for the Ukrainian fighters in that situation, but also for the hundreds of thousands of civilians that live in that city, will likely continue at this point. And Fareed, I should note, there are about 100,000 citizens that Ukraine says still need to be evacuated from Mariupol. Not one evacuation corridor was agreed to between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which means throughout the day on Sunday, all of those tens of thousands of people remain trapped and they can't leave.
Matt, the pictures we've seen are devastating, and it feels like the civilian casualties are probably a lot higher than people realize, possibly in the tens of thousands. What are you hearing very quickly about resupply? Are there arms getting through to the Ukrainians?
No, the simple answer is no. We've heard a little bit here and there about maybe some arms being able to trickle in, but what we've heard from the defenders that remain in that city is that they have not only gotten new ammunition, but also fresh food, fresh water, the kinds of things that they would need to sustain a fight for a long time, and yet they've managed to hold on this far. We'll see how things go in the coming days, Fareed.